The year is 1981. The London Marathon sees its inaugural race, Bucks Fizz wins the Eurovision Song Contest for England, and the first DeLorean sports car rolls off production lines. The 80s have begun to pick up steam, and arcades are becoming a part of everyday life. Space Invaders was just the beginning, Galaxian was a major step forward, Pac-Man was a smash hit. But this year would see the origin of one of the world's biggest video game franchises, if not the biggest. A series that currently comprises over 300 games, plus cartoons, movies, books, toys, music. In fact, forget just video games, it's one of the biggest franchises of any media. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The previous decade, a small Japanese playing card company had started to get a taste for the burgeoning electronics market. By the mid-70s, they had produced a number of electromechanical arcade games, including such titles as Laser Clay Shooting System and Wild Gunman, and secured a place in the video game market. While their output was slowed somewhat by the 1973 oil crisis, and the scarcity of plastics that followed, they continued to produce video games well into the 80s. One of their major successes was the Color TV game, a Pong console released exclusively in Japan. So as you can see, this lot weren't new to the video game business. They could see where it was headed, and naturally they wanted a piece of that pie. In 1981, they released a game that would cement their place in the video game industry forever. The company in question is a little outfit called Nintendo, and the game I refer to is, of course, Donkey Kong. The goal of Donkey Kong is to navigate to the top of each screen. But because life is never that simple, the top of each screen is also occupied by the titular giant ape, who torments the player with a constant barrage of barrel-shaped ordnance. And if you thought you could just pull a Muhammad Ali and let the overgrown gorilla tire himself out, you haven't accounted for the sneaky little fireballs which slowly follow the player up the stage, forcing them to stay on the move. Donkey Kong takes a slightly different approach to its level design than games we've seen before. The player's job, rather than clearing the screen of enemies or items, is simply to live long enough to work their way up the level and rescue the damsel in distress. The barrels come down at a regular rate, and their paths are normally predictable. They roll down to the left, then to the right. But in a capricious and unprecedented move, they will sometimes go down one of the ladders instead. This is just another method of keeping players on their toes, and keeping the coins flowing from their pockets. As ever though, you're not completely defenceless. In this game, salvation comes in the form of a giant mallet. Once collected, this can be used to smash barrels up for a brief respite and a few extra points. Not only that, but we also came across a concept that we're all used to today, but which was unheard of in 1981, the ability to jump. It was so unheard of in fact, that this is the first platform game in which the player can jump. Talk about making history. Much like Pac-Man, Donkey Kong doesn't really involve any violence, unless you count smashing a barrel to bits with a hammer a violent act. The protagonist's modus operandi is a lot more defensive, to the extent that jumping more than one barrel at once increases the score value of doing so. Speaking of that protagonist, doesn't he look familiar? I've specifically not named him, because when Donkey Kong was first released in Japan, he didn't have a name. It wasn't until the game had been out for a while before this little guy was given the nickname Jumpman. Because he's a man, and he jumps. In keeping with the theme, the aforementioned fair maiden is known, quite simply, as Lady. Once Jumpman reaches the end of the level, another exciting new concept rears its head. Most arcade goers were used to clearing a screen, only to be introduced with the same screen again, just slightly harder. Not so much in Donkey Kong. There are 4 distinct levels included, each with their own different gameplay quirks and unique mechanics. This is a drastic difference even to Miss Pac-Man which, while it did have several different maze designs, the gameplay remained largely identical in each one. Donkey Kong's levels take our hero across various areas of a construction site, with each one presenting new hazards, challenges, and minor tweaks in gameplay to keep players on their toes. Following the barrel stage, you'll first visit the affectionately named Pie Factory level, also known as the Cement Factory or the Conveyor stage. It looks a bit more straightforward when you first see it, until you find yourself fighting against the titular conveyor belts. The fireballs are back, and before reaching the final platform, Jumpman has to climb up a ladder, which really does not want to cooperate. There's also the elevator stage, so named for the 2 elevators at the start of the level. Mastering the jump is crucial to getting through this stage, as there's also a staircase of girders to navigate before you reach the end. And as if that wasn't enough, Donkey Kong's found a new thing to throw at you, an infinite supply of bouncy spring things. In the final stage, known as the Rivet stage, the goal is to knock down the building by taking giant chunks out of it. Seems a remarkably poor decision on the part of Jumpman, who stands to get crushed by the resulting cascade of construction gear, but he gets out unscathed, while Donkey Kong plummets to his doom. And then it starts all over again, with faster, more difficult gameplay. As expected from an 80s arcade title. Prior to releasing Donkey Kong, Nintendo had seen moderate success in Japan with their 1980 game Radar Scope. It was a simple space shooter, and while its graphics were technically impressive for the time, the gameplay didn't have much to offer beyond what was already available. This was made apparent when they brought the game to the United States. Between Space Invaders and Galaxian, the Americans had no time for Radar Scope. Stuck with thousands of unsold arcade cabinets, Nintendo had to come up with a way to get rid of them, without, getting rid of them. Fortunately, the Radar Scope hardware was flexible enough that the logical answer was to create a conversion kit. Conversion kits are, essentially, a way of getting a new game into your arcade without having to bring in a whole new machine. Using these, arcade owners had a relatively inexpensive way of keeping the stock fresh, and failed cabinets could have a new lease of life, particularly the ones that were sat in a warehouse collecting dust. But what were they going to convert it into? Given that the goal was to gain traction worldwide, not just in Japan, and given that they were gunning for the license at the time, the natural choice was to create a game based on Popeye. The project was handed off to a small team consisting of chief engineer Gunpei Yokoi, as well as first-time game designer Shigeru Miyamoto, on a budget of roughly $100,000. The aim was to get Popeye all the way up the screen to rescue Olive Oil from the clutches of his arch-nemesis Bluto. So how do we end up with a mustachioed carpenter and a gorilla? Trouble was, Nintendo were refused the license in the end, but instead of canning the project entirely, they took the opportunity to create their own characters based on the same sort of archetypes that they could use in later games if they wanted. The name Donkey Kong was picked because donkeys are known for being stubborn creatures, while Kong is apparently Japanese slang for a gorilla. Other stories suggest that donkeys are stupid, so the name basically means stupid ape. Jumpman's design was more of a practical decision than an artistic one. When you only have 4 colours to play with after all, you have to be careful about the sort of details you want to include. So Miyamoto gave him overalls, so that the players could clearly see his arms in motion. He also gave him a hat because, by his own admission, it would have been too difficult to try and animate his hair and make it look convincing. The moustache was picked for a similar reason. After all, if they'd tried to give him a mouth, it probably would have ended up looking like a moustache anyway. Before it came out, the game looked remarkably different to how we know it today. Originally it was a game where you had to escape from a maze, explains Miyamoto in an interview. To allow players to jump and avoid dangers would have spoiled the strategic element of the game. But then we thought, if you had a barrel rolling towards you, what would you do? One of Miyamoto's other plans was to have the screen scroll as you worked your way up, but this was beyond the technical limitations of the Radar Scope board. Before hitting US shores, there was one final little change that needed to be made. Remember that the main character was originally called Jumpman? Well, Nintendo of America weren't sure that the name would go down so well with the Western audience, but nobody was quite sure what to go for. Not until the company's landlord burst into their offices, demanding the rent that he was owed. Okay, perhaps it wasn't quite as dramatic as all that, but in any case, he proved to be the inspiration they needed. And so the blue and red carpenter was christened Mario. And the lady at the top was renamed Pauline, after the wife of Don James, the warehouse manager at Nintendo of America. Overall, the game took about 5 months to complete, again according to Miyamoto. That's a heck of a turnaround considering the hoops they had to jump through. But did it manage to save Nintendo's prospects of taking over America? You bet it did. Initial testing in the factory showed that the game was an immediate hit. Workers would keep playing after hours, it was so addictive. When it was released for location testing in a bar in Seattle, the owners ended up ordering more units to keep up with demand. Every one of the leftover Radar Scope machines was converted to Donkey Kong, and soon any arcade worth its salt was newly furnished with their very own barrel-slinging gorilla. The game was the hit that Nintendo were looking for. The old Homestead were pretty happy with it too. According to this report from Game Machine, it topped the charts in 1981, ahead of, Junputer, which apparently doesn't exist. Of course, like with any major arcade title, it had to make its way to home systems. By the following year, official conversions of Donkey Kong could be found on the big three systems at the time. Atari was straight in there, because of course it was. But it was also released around the same time on both the ColecoVision and the Intellivision. Each version has its own interpretations of the characters. The Atari 2600 version sees a jelly baby hurling giant stale cookies at a bloke in a onesie. The Intellivision programmers gave us the creature from the Black Lagoon, starring a Mario who wouldn't be out of place in a Beano comic. I perhaps shouldn't be too harsh on these early attempts because they are, well, early. The ColecoVision Donkey Kong is the best of these initial conversions, both in terms of its graphics and its gameplay. Unlike the home versions of Space Invaders and Pac-Man though, none of them quite compared to the arcade original. None, that is, until Nintendo themselves slid into the home console market. You'd be forgiven for thinking that this is in fact the arcade version, especially if you'd just bought it new in 1983 to play on your Nintendo family computer. From initial appearances, it's as accurate as you could possibly hope for in a home console. There are some bits missing though. For example, while Donkey Kong is properly animated during gameplay, there are no cutscenes between levels showing him climbing up the building. This conversion is also missing a whole level, the Pie Factory. Nevertheless, the ability to play such an impressive conversion at home was enough to overlook these differences. Before we move on entirely, it's worth pointing out that this wasn't the final version of Donkey Kong for NES. In fact, there wouldn't be a more accurate home version until a full 29 years after the arcade game's debut. This version, dubbed Donkey Kong Original Edition, restores the Pie Factory stage as well as the intermission animations, making this the definitive home port of the game. Would have been nice while the system was still current, but hey, better late than never.
Picture the scene. It's 1984 and a 5-year-old Epic Da Vinci comes home from school to see that my family have brought an Atari 2600. I marvelled at the wood panelling on it, perfectly matching the wood grain on our TV. This was my first ever video game system, and a result of this, I thought it was the best thing ever, which is why I can probably remember this console more than a few of the others that superseded it. However, my memories were wrong, and highly rose-tinted. I thought Donkey Kong himself was actually Bongo for Rainbow. We didn't even have the box art to look at what the picture looked like on the front, so every time I watched Rainbow from then on, I was hoping to see the jump hammer guy. I remember being quite good at this game considering it had quite simplistic gameplay, but I doubt I achieved any sort of high score because the attention span of a 5-year-old is about as short as, oh, shiny.
Like with Pac-Man, there's so much history to this series that it's just too much to cover in one video. In fact, I'll barely be able to scratch the surface. So, once again, I apologise if I miss out some of your favourites. The roaring success of Donkey Kong meant that, for the next few years, you couldn't go anywhere without seeing a DK cabinet. If it wasn't a cabinet, it was a home conversion. If it wasn't official, it was a blatant knockoff, the likes of which only Pac-Man could rival at the time. And if it wasn't a game at all, then it was one of the hundreds of items of merchandise filling up store shelves. The early 80s really were a turning point for this sort of thing. After all, if you have a character marketable enough to draw millions of punters into the arcades, then it's probably marketable enough for, say, a breakfast cereal.
Now, on your breakfast table, Donkey Kong brand cereal.
Crunchy bells are fun for breakfast. Donkey Kong cereal.
Help! Help!
Donkey Kong brand cereal has a...
Interestingly, this ad was the first time Mario was given a voice. Not a million miles away from what we ended up with either.
Kids, you want to help get Donkey Kong? Give me a crunch. One more.
Donkey Kong.
All this hype meant only one thing, the inevitable sequel. 1982 saw the not all that long awaited follow-up to Donkey Kong Jr. The premise of the game is virtually identical to the original. Make your way up a single screen, reach the top, move on to the next level. However, Donkey Kong Jr. leans much more heavily on the platforming aspect. While you don't have a constant cannonade of cylindrical caskets bouncing down towards you, you do have a number of nasty gaps to navigate instead. Jumping and climbing are the name of the game here. And in case getting the hang of Junior's heavier handling wasn't enough, there are also a bunch of walking gorilla traps, known as snapjaws, between you and your goal. Your goal being to reach Donkey Kong, trapped in a cage that's barely big enough for him, while Mario stands there with a whip. How troubling. Instead of ladders, ascending the level requires the use of vines and poles. Climbing one is, well, it's extremely slow. Climbing two at once is considerably quicker, but also opens the player up to getting chomped by a snapjaw. There are also fruits dotted around which can be collected for points. You may notice that they drop down when touched. Time it right and you can smash those traps up a treat. As in the previous game, there are 4 levels. Starting from the stage referred to as Vine Stage, you then move on to the Springboard Stage, so called because of the springboard, before entering Mario's hideout. Mario really needs to bring in a Sparky to sort out all these electrical hazards. The final stage, termed the Chain Stage, tasks the player with breaking Donkey Kong out of his inhumane prison by shuffling each of the keys up the chains. Once he's free, Mario will lay chase, only to take a big gorilla foot to the face. Compared to the previous game, Junior is a remarkable step up in difficulty. Maybe it's just me, but it feels like a real struggle to even get past the first screen. It doesn't help that the titular ape is such a huge and slow moving target either. Like its predecessor, Donkey Kong Jr. was a smash hit, coming in at 8th biggest arcade game of 1982, according to this survey. But perhaps the greatest indicator of this game's success was that yes, it too had a licensed breakfast cereal. Ah, the 80s. Cereal is one thing, but Donkey Kong and DK Jr. also featured quite heavily in the 1983 cartoon Saturday Supercade. According to this series, DK's a circus escapee. Does this mean Mario runs the circus? Whatever the case, the premise is that he and Pauline are out to catch him. Junior, on the other hand, has become a Scrappy-Doo type character, who's teamed up with some loser to try and find his dad. It's pretty awful, but for 1983, it was a breakout moment. They shared screen time with a few other arcade-based cartoons, such as Cubert and Frogger. In any case, this show, plus the earlier Pac-Man cartoon, demonstrated that there was more to video games than just monkeying around. While we're on the topic of DK Jr., it's worth mentioning the strange semi-sequel the game had, which was exclusive to the Famicom and later the Nintendo Entertainment System. Because of course it was. After all, who'd want to play an edutainment game in the arcades? The game in question was Donkey Kong Jr. Math. And, well, it's Donkey Kong Jr. but with added maths. Yeah. There's not really a great deal to say about this one. You get 2 game modes. The first is a competitive 2-player race to see who can maths the quickest. Donkey Kong will display a number at the top, and the players must use the numbers on the screen to try and calculate the number displayed, with the help of the operators along the bottom. It starts off simple, but soon you'll have larger numbers and negatives to deal with. Now I can't claim to fully understand the bohemian youth of Japan in 1983, but I can't imagine many of them were inviting the mates round for an exciting evening of quick sums. Anyway, the second game is a single player game, which tasks you with doing a bit of long multiplication. Given how long it's been since I last attempted to do it this way, I wasn't expecting I'd be great at this game, but I just couldn't work it out at all. Each chain corresponds to one of the number spaces in the equation, and climbing up increases the number that's in the box. Maybe I was just too impatient, but I couldn't get the numbers to go into the lower box. Fortunately, climbing up the far left chain solves the puzzle for you, and Junior seems pleased enough about that outcome that I'm not going to argue. Reception to this game was not exactly positive when it was released, and this could have been in part due to the lack of educational software available at the time. After all, the world hadn't yet seen the Oregon Trail, the title that had put edutainment into every school and home. Adding to that, critics weren't convinced that it was all that useful as an educational aid. As reported by the LA Times, kids like to do their homework and then play games. Junior Math was originally intended to be one of a 3-part NES educational library. The 2 other games were to be a Popeye literacy game and a Donkey Kong music game. Due to Junior Math's poor reception, however, the Popeye game remained a Japanese exclusive, and the music game was never released at all. although they did keep hold of the idea for a while, as we'll later see. Following his shameful defeat at the hands of the Kongs, Mario would branch off into his own series in 1983, one that would see a moderate amount of success and, 3 or 4 games or so. But Nintendo weren't about to leave DK in the lurch, and so later on in 1983, his third game was revealed, the aptly titled Donkey Kong 3. You see, Namco, if you're gonna make a threequel, make it straightforward. I'm just glad it's not called Dunk Plus. The comparisons to Galaga aren't entirely irrelevant, since this game is a fixed vertical shooter in which the enemies are bugs. Bit of a departure, wouldn't you say? Donkey Kong's got himself stuck in a greenhouse, and for some reason, he's bent on angering the local creepy crawly population by jabbing at the hives. The player's job, as Stanley the groundskeeper, is to fend off the bugs and get the Kong out of his greenhouse, using the power of bug spray. Occasionally, DK will drop a golden bug spray which is much more powerful, and makes it easier to clear out the greenhouse, but for the most part, you're just spraying Donkey Kong in the arse and defending yourself against bugs. Lots and lots of bugs. There's actually a touch of missile command in here as well, since you're also defending the plants at the bottom of the screen. The more that survive each wave, the more bonus points you get at the end. Just as in the previous 2 games, there are a few different levels in DK3, but unlike its predecessors, the gameplay remains basically the same in each one. The main difference is in the variety of enemies. Most will simply fly down and attack you, some are slower and take 2 hits, and some will shoot back at you. Most levels have these worms which can't be killed with regular bug spray, but it does knock them out and block you from hitting Donkey Kong. And mind you don't get hit, or else Stanley will get knocked unconscious, before being eaten alive. Gruesome. One trouble I came across in this game is that it's hard to know what you can and can't hit. After DK punches each hive, the bugs start to swarm around them, and I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be shooting at them, or at what point they were vulnerable to attack. It's also difficult to juggle everything, given that the game wants you to focus on effectively 3 different things at any given time. The worm stages are a bit more forgiving, since you don't have the constant barrage of insects, but on the other hand, you've got DK chucking coconuts at you which you have to dodge, so it's still not exactly plain sailing. The game got a reasonable write-up when it was released, but it flopped in North America, possibly due to the popularity of Mario Brothers, and the fact that game bears more resemblance to Donkey Kong than Donkey Kong 3 did. In Japan, however, it saw a little more popularity, and unbelievably it got a follow-up, exclusive to the NEC PC8801, PC6601, and the Sharp X1 home computers. On first inspection, Donkey Kong 3 The Great Counterattack is similar to the arcade original, and you're still spraying Donkey Kong in a very particular location with bug spray, in order to shove him off the top of the screen. Once you get into it though, it's actually even more like Galaga than before. The bugs are significantly less aggressive than they were in the greenhouse, and they'll just float along merrily and make a vague attempt to shoot at you, but succeed more so in just getting in the way. The worms are back too, and they fill the same role as they did in the arcades. I'll shut up about Galaga as soon as I've talked about the bonus stage. It's nicked from Galaga. Moving on. You may have noticed this already, but possibly the most interesting or bizarre difference between the 2 games is that the background keeps changing. It starts off fairly reasonable. The first level takes place on a highway before going to this nice pastoral scene. But then, the aliens. Yes. What is this for? Are they just kicking around watching all this take place? Is Donkey Kong actually tiny? The UFO just raises even further questions. And when you get into space, No, I said I'd shut up about Galaga. All in all, it's a fun little game, even if you can get away with just standing completely still 90% of the time. And a fascinating curio. This game wasn't some knockoff bedroom conversion after all. It was developed by Hudson Soft, and officially licensed by Nintendo. Hudson were responsible for converting quite a few Nintendo properties over to Japanese home computers at the time, perhaps the most famous example being Super Mario Bros. Special. What's interesting about DK3 though, is that it took just over 30 years between its original release in 1984 and the first major effort to get it to Western shores in 2018. And I don't mean an official port or anything, I mean a group of enthusiasts getting together to purchase a copy of the game from Yahoo Auctions in Japan. You see, this game is pretty rare. Supposedly it wasn't advertised very well by Hudson, only appearing in a few magazines and with very little in the way of screenshots. All this, by the way, was suggested by a person known as Famicomical, who was responsible for bidding on the auction, winning it at a cost of 44,500 yen, roughly £280. They were also in charge of dumping the disc, and this is the version you see before you right now. So this game is not only an intriguing curiosity, but a great example of video game preservation done right. The peacetime between Mario and Donkey Kong wouldn't last. They may have gone their separate ways during the latter half of the 80s, and Mario may have enjoyed success in his own adventures, but they were back at it by 1994 and the release of Donkey Kong on the Game Boy, which was, of course, Game Boy Color enhanced. And Mario wears white in this one, which looks strange, but we'll go with it. The premise is much the same as the arcade original, and it actually plays like an enhanced remake. The levels are the same as before. You have the construction site which gets smashed up in the same way, you have the pie factory in the spring stage, and the final battle in which you dismantle the scaffolding. There are a few little differences though. First of all, Mario has a much more expansive moveset. On top of his ability to run, jump and climb ladders, he's also able to do a handstand, which in turn allows him to jump even higher. He can also do a somersault by jumping while changing direction, a move which will be reused in Super Mario 64 a couple of years later. The new jumps, unfortunately, make these levels trivially easy. Instead of having to deal with the ladders, Mario can just effortlessly leap to the next platform. Even the hammers are less restrictive, as with a bit of clever footwork, unlike what I'm capable of, Mario can throw the hammer away, jump up, and catch it again on the next platform up. Get to the end of these levels though, and the real game reveals itself. So, it turns out this game is more of a puzzle platformer. Using his newfound jumping abilities, as well as helpful structural elements such as horizontal bars and self-building bridges, Mario's task is essentially to reach the door at the end of each level, gigantic key in hand. The game takes one or two cues from Super Mario Bros. 2 as well, in that Mario can lift certain items and enemies over his head, using them as platforms or as projectiles. The titular Kong has got a few new tricks up his sleeve as well. When you first reach him, he won't just stand there and wait for you to climb up to his position as before, you'll have to get past all the junk he throws at you too. The fight would continue 10 years and 2 consoles later, with the release of Mario vs Donkey Kong for the Game Boy Advance. Essentially it's the same sort of thing, but with pre-rendered graphics. There's also slightly more story this time. Rather than kidnapping Pauline, the game instead starts with a DK sat at home channel surfing. You know, standard guerrilla stuff. He sees an advert for mini Mario toys, clockwork replicas of everyone's favourite red fella, and decides he needs to have them. And because the Mushroom Kingdom doesn't believe in proper security, not even in its cities and major production centres, the Kong is able to just waltz in and take what he likes. And Mario just happens to be walking by when all this takes place, so naturally it's his job to go off and reclaim the stolen goods. Evidently Bowser's on holiday during the events of this game. Or maybe all those games are actually staged and this one takes place in the real world? I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking it. There are lots more games along this line, such as the DS games March of the Minis and Miniland Mayhem, which are Lemming-style puzzlers starring the Mini Mario toys. There's even an Amiibo-based game on the Wii U, but that requires Amiibo, which I don't have. With the advent of these games, it would seem that the traditional Donkey Kong platformer was old hat. Which seems a shame, given that the original was itself the genesis of platformers as we know them today. But, as you may be aware and anticipating right now, that wasn't true in the slightest. The Donkey Kong platformer was, in fact, alive and well. It just took a slightly different form to what everyone was used to. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, aren't we? Donkey Kong's classic platformer series made for some enjoyable gaming experiences, but they weren't exactly as earth-shattering as the original game was. And for good reason. The cat was out of the bag, and everyone was making platformers now. Indeed, they were the de facto standard on Nintendo's own console. If it wasn't a scrolling shooter or a puzzle game, it was most likely a platformer. As the 8-bit era transitioned into 16-bit, games became far more lavish affairs, with the power behind them to produce the sort of graphics and audio you'd previously only have seen in the arcades. I hesitate to say arcade quality, but the consoles were certainly catching up. And and with all this new power, there came a lot more competition. This was the beginning of the Bit Wars, where everyone was trying to win customers over by throwing numbers at them in increasingly aggressive marketing campaigns. And over the course of the 16-bit era, Nintendo faced pressure from the PC Engine and its CD-ROM add-on, the supposedly 64-bit Jaguar, the 3DO, and, of course, the Mega Drive. The system that could apparently do everything Nintendo couldn't.
What Nintendo?
One of those everythings was the 1993 platformer Aladdin. Now, Aladdin was published on both the Mega Drive and the SNES, but in all but name they were almost completely different games. The SNES version featured lively graphics and exciting gameplay centered around acrobatics, but when put alongside the Mega Drive version, it kind of pales in comparison to the latter game's cartoon quality animation. And while it had a well-earned reputation for being unfairly difficult at times, who cares about gameplay when your game looks as close as was possible to the film it was based on? The point was, the game was smooth and sleek in ways that the SNES version was not, and it made Nintendo turn their heads. Around this time, a burgeoning studio from Leicestershire, England had recently splashed out on a bunch of Silicon Graphics workstations. This studio had seen huge success on the NES, in no small part due to Nintendo generously pumping cash into them. And if anyone knew how to squeeze the most out of a gaming system, it was Rare. We've actually met them before. They were responsible for the mind-blowing Pinbot conversion for the NES, and now they were ready to show what the SNES was really capable of. With their shiny new toys at work, they set out to create something so jaw-droppingly amazing that nobody could possibly resist picking up a Nintendo console. The result was 1994's Donkey Kong Country, or Super Donkey Kong as it was known in Japan. From the word go, you can see that this game was something else. For starters, the game is 3D. And I know it's not proper 3D, it's two-dimensional renders of 3D graphics, but that didn't matter. The game is, for all intents and purposes, 3D. Because everything had to be 3D in the 90s. Before this, pre-rendered graphics were largely limited to the realm of FMV sequences. The closest you could get to a fully pre-rendered game at home was Myst, and, not to put too fine a point on it, it's primitive. So for something like DKC to come along and not only have fully pre-rendered graphics, but use them in a fast-paced platformer with silky smooth animations, it was unheard of. The game stars a newly redesigned Donkey Kong, sporting a fetching red tie, added such that he'd have a distinctive article of clothing, much like Mario's red cap. Or is it? You see, the protagonist of this game is not the Donkey Kong who ran off with Pauline back in 1981. That guy is now known as Cranky Kong and appears at the very start of the game, only to get shoved rather unceremoniously out of the way by the character now known as Donkey Kong. Kinda makes you question how old Mario is exactly. Who knows what happened to Donkey Kong Jr. because he doesn't show up at all, but I digress. Joining DK is a totally new character, Diddy Kong, a monkey in a red cap. Both characters are playable and can be switched between on the fly during gameplay. They also act as hit points. Lose one Kong and the other can keep going until either he finds his buddy or gets knocked out himself. In addition to these two, you'll meet Candy Kong, who will save your game at regular intervals, and fan favourite Funky Kong, whose flight services can be used to fast travel to any previously completed level. Some of the levels also feature helpful animals, such as Rambi the Rhino, Ongard the Swordfish, and Winky the Frog. They're mostly there to spice the gameplay up a little, but can also help reach hidden areas and generally make things a little easier for the Kongs. But who's the antagonist in this game? Mario perhaps, back to seek revenge against all ape kind? King Bowser having taken a brief respite from his struggles with the Mushroom Kingdom? Not quite. For this game, Rare created an entirely new set of baddies, the Kremlings and their leader, King K. Rool. You may be wondering if there's a plot here. After all, without any in-game backstory to speak of, the game just throws you in to run around in the jungle as you please. Well, the premise is that K. Rool has stolen the Kong's bananas, and so the goal is simply to reclaim them by beating up every creature that dares oppose you. Vultures, gophers, armadillos, none can stand between a Kong and his bananas. As well as the traditional method of jumping on top of an enemy, each Kong also has a melee attack. Donkey Kong rolls forwards while Diddy does a cartwheel. These attacks don't look like much, but successfully hitting one enemy with it allows you to chain multiple attacks together to become this spinning brown ball of death. Donkey Kong can also drum his hands on the ground, though to what purpose I couldn't figure out. Each world has a distinct level theme. Starting from the jungle, you'll visit mountains, caverns, icy peaks, forested areas that resemble Return of the Jedi, and a gross factory. I don't think that stuff's safe to swim in, guys. It's really impressive just how much they've managed to cram onto this cartridge, particularly since we're still in the era where cartridge space is at a premium. If this was on a CD-ROM, then I wouldn't think twice about it, but the fact that everything is pre-rendered, smoothly animated, remarkably detailed, and on the SNES, is still kind of mind-blowing to me. And invariably there are bosses. What more do you want? The bosses feel like pushovers for the most part, although I did like the concept of this one, which is basically a gauntlet of enemies you've already faced. King K. Rool occupies his own distinct level, the Gangplank Galleon. And yes, the trick in the middle caught me off guard the first time I saw it. Donkey Kong Country was a wild success. Despite being released later on in the console's lifetime, it became its third biggest selling game, beating out both Street Fighter II and Super Mario Kart. By Rare's own admission, it helped renew the lifespan of the SNES, and the system sustained a healthy competition against the growing number of CD-based consoles. How else to celebrate this success but to make a sequel? That sequel was Diddy's Conquest, not Diddy Kong's Quest, though that'd make more sense. And for the most part, it's more of the same. No bad thing really. The premise here is that Donkey Kong has somehow got himself kidnapped, and so it's down to Diddy and his girlfriend Dixie to rescue him. All pretty standard stuff. The controls are essentially the same, except this time around, your partner actually has some function outside of being an extra hit point. Tired of having to settle with barrels as a throwable projectile? Why not throw a monkey instead? This should be used sparingly though, because if you sling your simian sidekick at something too tough for them to handle, you'll lose them and have to find a barrel to free them again. Also, if you throw them at nothing, they just sit there looking a little sorry for themselves until you go get them, which itself leaves them open to attack. On top of that, Dixie also has the ability to make a helicopter out of her hair.
Make a chopper of your hair. Sounds like someone's been eating paint chips again.
It does feel as if there's a greater emphasis on secrets this time around, particularly since there's a new collectible. Creme coins can be acquired by completing hidden bonus games found in each level. They mostly amount to platforming challenges, and some of them require you to work out the unique quirks of the animal friends to progress. Others task you with collecting all the stars in the stage. It offers a nice break in the gameplay, and gives you a chance to really hone in your platforming skills, since you can just keep retrying them until you get it right. You can also collect coins at the end of a level. Hit the target with enough force and at just the right time, and you'll be rewarded with a coin. Or a 1-up. Or just a bunch of bananas. Or nothing at all if you don't quite do it right. It's really fun to try and find these hidden secrets, although it can be a pain when sometimes you end up taking several steps backwards just to get a coin. For all its good points and as strong a sequel as it is, unfortunately it also has one of the worst save systems I've ever seen in a game. The first games wasn't ideal, since the save point would only appear after you completed a number of levels in each world, and you couldn't traverse worlds without first finding Funky Kong. All a bit of a faff, but at least once you'd reached the save point, you could save whenever you liked. Now imagine that, except this time you have to pay coins to be able to save. So not only do you have to put up with this cumbersome game of Ludo just to be able to save, you then have to use up all your hard-earned coins. Sure, you can afford it in most cases, but in my case at least, I was reluctant to save too often in case I ran out and needed the coins for later. Aside from that though, Diddy's Conquest is a great sequel, and another example of the SNES's graphical capabilities. Consumers at the time thought the same thing, because it became the best-selling non-packing SNES game. Bit of a mouthful, huh? There was also a threequel called Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. Again, it's more of the same but with another new hero, Kiddy Kong. They also added bear run shops, a bit more dialogue, and a map screen that reminds me of an RPG overworld. Unfortunately, by this time, the industry had moved on. The Saturn and PlayStation had brought in a new era of CD-based 3D games, and even the Nintendo 64 had already been out for a month in the US. It still managed to become the 11th best-selling game on the SNES though. Before we move on from these games, I should also mention that Donkey Kong Country was converted to the Game Boy with the title of Donkey Kong Land. I can't say I held out too much hope for this, especially after having seen the Game Boy version of Mortal Kombat, but it's actually surprisingly good for the system it's on. Ignoring the fact that we only have 4 colours to play with, there's still an impressive level of detail to be found here, and the smooth animations have carried over quite nicely. It can sometimes be a bit difficult working out what it is you're looking at. Characters and items blend into the background a little too easily, and it's a pain judging your jumps sometimes with the screen space being so small. The blurry screen of the original system doesn't help matters, but for a Game Boy conversion of one of the best looking SNES games out there, you can't really knock it. The second and third games had a similar treatment, and were similarly similar to their respective SNES originals. And in case you thought we were done with Donkey Kong Country, let's not forget the other piece of media associated with the game. I'm not going to beat around the bush here, but there was another Donkey Kong cartoon. It was CGI in an attempt to replicate Rare's art style, and you know what, how about I just show you? Here's the thing, if you disregard the animation, which is remarkably low quality and makes Donkey Kong look like he's made out of wood filler and slugs, it's actually not as awful as it looks. Certainly more entertaining than Pac-Man and the Ghostly Adventures.
Yikes! Sharks! Did he say sharks? Oh, I hate sharks! Did you say sharks? Did he hate sharks?
But I leave that to your discretion, because otherwise we'll be here all day.
Fast forward a few years and I'm in secondary school, and the new kid on the console block is the SNES, and I was right in the middle of its target audience. Everyone I knew had 96 levelled Mario World and was skilled at Mario Kart. We absorbed the game culture, we read magazines, watched Games Master. I opened up a magazine for the SNES which I used to love spending my pocket money on, called Control, and its main story was about Rare's new Donkey Kong Country. But what are these words I'm reading? Silicone graphics? Photorealistic? And oh my god, those screenshots. Surely they can't be from the SNES, can they? They were. The weeks rolled on as the hype train gained momentum, and I finally got to see demo footage of the game in motion. This was something special. It was the talk of the school, and I'm sure it accounted for some lower exam scores than anticipated. Finally, release day came. I remember it being a Friday, and as I set aside all weekend to play it, not like playing SNES games at the weekend was anything new, I was a shy nerd, it's all I did. My mum agreed to go down to local Woolworths and pick me up a copy. Luckily they had a copy in, but I don't think stock lasted too long on day one. I get home from school eager to try it, completely forgetting all I've been taught that day, plug it and flick the switch, off we go. Ha! There's an old monkey playing a record player, that's cute. What? DK enters the scene with his ghetto plaster. What a pre-title opening scene. And it's in 3D. I was mesmerised at the graphics right from the very start. So much so that I didn't really mind that the platforming was pretty average, to be honest. It was an awesome experience. Even the harder levels, I'm looking at you minecart sections. Unfortunately, this is where my 2D Donkey Kong story ends. I know there are sequels, but it got released in a time frame in my life when I was sitting my GCSEs and college, etc, etc. As you may have been able to tell from my little segment, the years have not been kind to my memory of distinct mechanics and details from these games. They are more memories of the experiences and feelings I had towards the games in general. But that doesn't detract from the fact that those are very pleasant memories. So thank you for those, Bungle from Rainbow.
So, as we've established by this point, the next generation of consoles was upon us, and upon them, the 3D platformer reigned supreme. For a little while anyway. And to follow on from the roaring success of his SNES titles, it was time for our favourite gorilla to make the transition to 3D. I mean 3D, not 2D 3D.
Here we go. Performance for you. If you know the words, you can join in too. Put your hands together if you wanna clap. As we dance you through this monkey rap.
Poetry. Donkey Kong 64 starts out with a monstrously long cutscene, which involves the Kremlings doing something. Unfortunately, I can't tell you much more, because it crashed partway through, and I'm not sitting through all that again. The gist is that he's nicked all the bananas again. We know the score by now. The first thing that strikes me about DK64 is just how slow it is. The frame rate I can kind of give them a pass on. After all, many of the N64's greatest games also suffered from low frame rates. It was just a fact of life for Nintendo fans at the time. Not only that, but this game's so beefy that it requires additional memory. Indeed, it was the first game to use the memory expansion pack, and certain releases of the game came bundled with the accessory. In short, it's a wonder it's running at all. What I can criticise though is the slow pacing. Dialogue, for example, scrolls automatically at a frustratingly lethargic pace, and sometimes there's a lot of it. And most of the time it's just someone calling you stupid, which is just great for my self-esteem. On top of that, instead of throwing the player in and letting them explore the controls and mechanics within, say, a safe hub world or an easy first level, you're instead given a bunch of tutorials, teaching you things like throwing and swimming. This could have all been done organically, and it just feels kind of disjointed. Once you get out of the tutorial, there's even more dialogue. Just let me play the game, for crying out loud. I do not need a dialogue box to tell me that this is a gate and requires one golden banana to pass. It's quite plain. So, after 15 minutes of faffing around, I'm finally in the first level. Now, one of the most common criticisms levelled at DK64 is that it's too much of a collectathon for its own good. Let's compare the numbers, shall we? Super Mario 64 has 2 collectibles, coins and power stars. Spyro has 3, treasure, dragons and eggs. And the eggs aren't introduced until later on. Crash Bandicoot Warped has 4, Wumpa Fruit, crystals, gems and relics. Again, not all of them are relevant until you've been playing for a while. Donkey Kong 64 has 6, and they're all made apparent in the very first level. 3 show up as soon as you start, with the other 3 coming into play not long after. We have, in order of appearance, golden bananas, regular bananas, banana medals, Kongs, coins, and blueprints. There are also new abilities to unlock, but I won't count that. And apparently the game introduces even more items to collect as you progress. You may be thinking, okay, but surely some of these collectibles are just bonus items. That's a fair assumption, and to go back to Crash, you didn't actually need to collect a single gem to get to the end of the game. Mario 64 required you to collect a certain number of stars before progressing, but to complete the game, you only needed 70 of the game's 120 stars. And again, that's only one collectible. But in DK64, all the collectibles are required to progress. You don't need to 100% the thing, but you do need a bit of everything, which invariably means a lot of backtracking. This is, unfortunately, a very valid criticism, and perhaps the game's biggest flaw. It's overwhelming. You're running around and seeing all this stuff that you have to get, and not only that, but some of it you can't get straight away. If you see a blueprint that isn't blue, then tough luck. You're not having it unless you're playing as the relevant Kong. How do you switch Kongs? You have to find a barrel, usually somewhere near the start of the level. I say this is unfortunate because when you're actually playing, the game is pretty solid. The movement feels tight and the combat is satisfying. The jumping can feel a little clumsy, but on the whole, it works well enough. When you eventually meet Funky Kong, who looks terrifying in this game, and get a gun, it's a little awkward to aim, but you do get used to it. Something I didn't get used to though, is the fact that there are seemingly more abilities than there are buttons on the controller. Given that the N64 controller isn't exactly well endowed with a huge array of buttons, I can forgive them somewhat. But a better idea perhaps would have been to not have so many abilities in the first place. I don't want to be negative towards the game, because it's clear a lot of effort and thought has been put into it. It just feels like it could have done with someone saying, right, enough is enough. Before we move on, DK64 also contained a full arcade port of the original Donkey Kong. This might not seem remarkable. After all, pretty much every Space Invaders game from around this point onwards contained an arcade-accurate port of the original, or at least an attempt at it. So why should we be surprised here? Especially since we now know Rare were big fans of sticking emulators in the games, and there's even a version of the early game Jetpack included in DK64. Well, turns out the arcade version of Donkey Kong was under a bit of dispute. You see, when it was first manufactured, Nintendo contracted manufacturer Ikegami Tsushinki exclusively to build and program the arcade boards. But when Donkey Kong began to rise in popularity, Nintendo completely ignored the exclusive bit of the contract and built their own boards anyway. Ikegami Tsushinki filed a lawsuit against them in 1983, which wouldn't be settled until 1990. As such, there have only been 2 official arcade ports of Donkey Kong to date, DK64's version and the Arcade Archives version released on Switch in 2018, almost 20 years later. Now I should practice what I preach and say that's enough for Donkey Kong 64. 3 years after Donkey Kong 64 was released, Rare was famously purchased by Microsoft, making this their last fully fledged Donkey Kong game to date. What were Nintendo to do now? They had this character, the star of some of the best-selling Nintendo games ever made, and the people responsible for making them had been snatched away by the highest bidder. However, they also had a shiny new console, the GameCube. So this would be the perfect opportunity to show the crisp 3D graphics that the series was famous for in real time. So would this first game be a bigger, more feature-packed sequel to DK64? Maybe we'd even get a Donkey Kong Country 4. Well, not quite. Donkey Kong's first GameCube outing was the now infamous Donkey Konga. First released in Japan in 2003, before making it to the rest of the world the following year. Why is it infamous, you ask? Because of these. Yep, this exists. If you're not aware of the Donkey Kong bongos, you're one of today's lucky 10,000. They often appear in lists of silliest video game controllers, lists usually populated with weird third-party pads for ancient home computers, and bizarre promotional items which you can technically use to play a video game. But these are the genuine article, and they've certainly made history. There is no good way to position these so you can actually play with them, by the way. You've either got to balance them precariously on your lap, or hunch yourself over a coffee table. Or get yourself a massive desk. But who in 2004 was playing the GameCube at a desk? The game itself is a fairly straightforward rhythm game. You have 3 controls, left bongo, right bongo, and clap. And your goal is to bongo your way through one of the 31 included songs as accurately, and as in time, as possible. It really is as simple as that. Hit the correct bongos in time with the music, or in time with the coloured circle careening across the screen, and you win! Each bongo tap and clap is rated between great and miss, which all add up to give you your final score at the end. Any mistakes you see here are purely down to delays induced by my capture hardware. Honest. You also get a variety of difficulty levels, each of which ramps up the difficulty by adding more notes to play. While playing a song, you'll see a variety of distractions, including the Kongs, their animal friends, and even King K. Rool. I have to say, aside from Donkey and Diddy slapping away at their respective bongos, the quality of animation is a little disappointing. I can let them off a bit because it's not the main focus, but when you associate the series with fluid 3D animation, it's really noticeable. Outside of the main game, you also have a handful of minigames, which makes me wonder if they should have made a WarioWare game for the bongos. That would have been chaotic. Now, any arcade aficionados among you, particularly those with a thing for rhythm games, may think this looks familiar. You may now be trying to think of another game where you hit drums in time to music. Well, let me help you out a little. This is Taiko no Tatsujin, an arcade game developed by Namco, whose cabinet includes a giant taiko drum and 2 sticks. And you have to play along to a song, hitting the left and right sides of the drum with correct timing. Specifically, this is the PlayStation 2 version, in case you're wondering. Donkey Konga is essentially the GameCube version of Taiko no Tatsujin, and was developed by many of the same people. Donkey Konga wasn't super well received at the time, but despite that, it got 2 sequels. Donkey Konga 2 was released worldwide around a year after the first game, but Donkey Konga 3 was exclusive to Japan. And in case you're wondering what they look like, they're virtually the same game, but with different songs. So there's your obvious bongo game, but how about a less obvious use? How about a platformer? Yep, we finally got one. Released in Japan in 2004, and the rest of the world in 2005, this is Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. And it's a Donkey Kong Country style platformer which you play exclusively using the bongos. Now, despite that description, it actually doesn't work all that badly. Certain concessions have been made with the gameplay to make it a bit more manageable with only 3 controls. So you're not, for example, jumping between very precise platforms, and you're not doing any climbing or bouncing on top of enemies, or anything like that. What's presented is a fun platforming adventure in which Donkey Kong beats the snot out of anything that moves, all to reach a giant miscellaneous fruit at the end of the level. He's not even after his banana horde this time, that's one hungry Kong. To move around, you hit the bongo in the direction you want to go, then tap them to run faster. Hitting both is your jump button, and clapping does basically everything else. Gathering bananas, knocking out enemies, and activating platforms in the environment is all done by clapping your hands, or alternatively hitting the side of the bongo. This wouldn't be so bad, but the frequency with which you need to clap really wears your hands out after a while. I should mention that even though the controls work quite well, they're still pretty clumsy and imprecise. The trouble is, you can't react quickly because the bongos just aren't built for that. So you may see a clump of bananas in the air and try to clap as you're flying past them, but you may clap too early or too late, or it may not even register in time, or at all. The game has been designed to take this into account as much as possible, but there are still moments where I found myself falling off platforms unexpectedly when all I wanted to do was jump. It doesn't help that you're constantly taking your hands off the controls too. The selection of enemies this time around is very different. Having apparently exiled the Kremlings for good, the big bad this time around is this gang of rival Kongs. Who are they? Nobody knows. The manual doesn't help. The story basically amounts to Donkey Kong punches things. DK's adversaries consist of miscellaneous jungle creatures such as pigs, frogs, rats, and these weird spectral dudes. In theory, each one requires a unique approach. In practice, you can take most of them out just by clapping and then running into them. Which is fine because you're playing with bongos, so you really don't want to overcomplicate matters. Alongside them, you'll face a boss every few levels. What more do you... never mind. They usually amount to waiting for something to happen, then clapping at the right time to knock the boss out before proceeding to smack them around a bit. Tell you what, DK pulls no punches in this game, literally. He just smashes through the whole jungle and everything in it. He's a violent and bloodthirsty Kong. Don't believe me? Just look at that face and tell me that's not the face of an unhinged ape. With no Kremlings left to fight, he takes his anger out on his fellow Kongs and literally punches them into submission, such as the horrifying dystopian vision presented to us in Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. Or maybe I'm just reading a little too deep into it. So why dispense with a classic crocodilian antagonist that we all know and love? The reason was given in a 2005 interview with the game's director, Yoshiaki Koizumi, and producer Takeo Shimizu. Originally this interview was translated for an IGN article, but according to Donkey Kong fansite DK Vine, this interview was mistranslated. There's a bit of a rabbit hole here, so I'll leave that one with you. Anyway, in this interview, Koizumi states that all the characters, outside of DK himself and the bananas, are original. It seems that the idea for the game was to stand apart from the DKC games, and for Nintendo to make their own mark on the series. And I think that's a commendable effort.
Hi, my name is Michiel Kroder. I develop games with my Hitpiece Studio outfit, run a podcast about the arcade games of the 1980s and the 1990s with Ben of One Credit Classics, which is called Video Wizards, and I also contribute to the Kenny Rins podcast of deep dive video game reviews as a recurring panel member. With Kenny Rins, we've looked at a lot of games starring and featuring the big ape Donkey Kong himself, and or his offspring, depending on how invested you are in a franchise's deep lore and official timeline. I'm sure Lunar Looney has contributions about the original arcade game and the country platformers already, so I thought to yet once again put in a good word for what is in my book a rather unique side-scrolling platformer and an absolute Nintendo GameCube gem, Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. Jungle Beat is another game we dedicated the show to on Kenny Rins, and leading up to the recording I decided to return to my 2005 save file and get a bit good at the game, getting a lot more of those golden medals and even discovering that platinum medals existed in the game during the process. But what is Donkey Kong Jungle Beat? In its original, and in my book still definitive version, it's a beautiful looking, highly expressive cross between a DK country style, momentum based platformer and something like Tony Hawk, where you start stringing moves and combos together to get the highest scores and unlock more in the game. And it's all controlled with a set of plastic bongos as made famous by the Donkey Konga rhythm action games. Just completing the standard levels isn't that exciting or even the point in Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. You need to get into that high scoring mindset and derive pleasure from stringing athletic combos together without your main character's simian feet ever touching the ground. It's only then, when you put in the hours and the effort, that you get most out of the game. As exemplified by the visible elation I experienced on my streams, once I started executing some full stage combos in the harder later levels. So, if you like what you're hearing, grab yourself a copy of Donkey Kong Jungle Beat for GameCube, a set of plastic bongos, and get to slapping, stomping and clapping while you nab those sumptuous bananas.
And with that, I've just shown you every single game that officially supports the Bongos. Yep, just 4 games. You'd think that after going to all the effort to design and manufacture a brand new peripheral, they'd have a bit more to show for it. I'm telling you, WarioWare. Actually, there was going to be a 5th game in the Bongo lineup. It was going to be a guerrilla flavoured racing game called Donkey Kong Bongo Blast. But by the time it was released in 2007, it had been rewritten for Nintendo's next console, the Wii. Unfortunately, they didn't change the controls, so instead of slapping at a solid piece of plastic, you're instead slapping at thin air. This is what we in the trade call waggle controls. Waggle both the Wii remote and the attached nunchuck in rhythm to speed up, and waggle either one to turn left or right. Steering is non-existent. Your chosen character will navigate the track automatically, so all you need to worry about is, well, everything else. The track is littered with obstacles of various shapes and sizes. You'll see a variety of classic enemies and appropriate environmental hazards, but mostly it's just barrels. You can either go around them, jump over them by hitting both bongos, swinging both controllers, or hit the attack button to smash through them. Yep, there's an attack button. Not only can you slap barrels out of the way like a biscuit out of a passing stranger's hand, you can also use it to enforce social distancing on anyone who gets too close to you. Is this Donkey Kong or Road Rash? In addition to the obstacles, there are also barrels you can jump into to activate shortcuts. Occasionally you'll come across animal friends too, although the only one I saw was On Guard the Swordfish. You can also collect power-ups, although quite what they do isn't all that clear, at least not at first. I can kind of forgive them for that, because it's a bit like that with every racing game if you haven't played it before. I think the trouble here is that unless your opponent is right in front of you, you don't get a great deal of visual feedback, and when you yourself get hit, you don't always see what exactly it was that hit you. But that's probably something you get used to, and really, the power-ups aren't likely to make or break your race. The best method is to focus on speed boosts. How do you get a speed boost? By collecting bananas, of course. You see this bar on the right? Fill it up with banana juice, I guess. And you can perform what's called a wild move. Pull back on the joystick like it's a pinball game, let go and you'll zoom forwards, smashing through most anything in your path. And that's the real strategy. You see, if you hit a barrel while doing a wild move, it'll prolong your speed boost. Chain multiple barrels together and you can cover so much distance that the other racers have virtually no chance of catching up. Speaking of the racers, there are a whole bunch of characters you can pick from. Almost the entire Kong lineup to date features in this game, and Tiny Kong is the only one who has visibly aged, and now looks like she should be doing capoeira. On the Kremling side, most of the characters are standard enemies from previous games, with a few new additions specifically made for this game. Cranky, Wrinkly and King K. Rool amongst others can only be unlocked by completing Candy's challenges, and somehow Candy is wearing even less than she did previously. Also, this game is, to date, Lanky Kong's last appearance as a major character. I can't think of a greater injustice. This isn't a bad racing game per se. The entire novelty, however, lies in the waggle controls, and they're not all that novel really. The biggest crime this game commits is that, despite the Wii having all of 4 very prominent GameCube controller ports, this game still doesn't work with the bongos. Could have been done, but it wasn't for whatever reason. Whatever control method you use though, it still ends up being a bit middle of the road. And when Mario Kart Wii came along the following year, there wasn't really much point in playing Barrel Blast anymore. Especially since, technically, Mario Kart works with the bongos. But, kart racing fans among you are no doubt aware this wasn't the only racing game in the series. I often mention that one of the biggest trends in the 90s was to make everything 3D. Well, the other biggest trend was the kart racer. And Rare's answer to this was the wildly popular Diddy Kong Racing. If you were an N64 fan at the time, and particularly a Mario Kart fan, this game likely made you turn your head and shout,
"Whoa, nice graphics! I'd like to get my hands on that game!"
Because where Mario Kart 64 used mostly 2D elements within a 3D environment, Diddy Kong Racing was as 3D as they come. It was very impressive for the time, and once again showed that Rare still knew how to make the most out of whatever system they had their hands on. Not only that, but surprisingly it took a very different approach to its gameplay, an idea which would be borrowed by quite a few developers after the fact. Most kart races, such as Mario Kart, would have you compete in a series of races, usually grouped into a cup or a Grand Prix or whatever. You'd select these from a menu and get dropped straight into a race. Diddy, on the other hand, plays more like a 3D platformer. except you're in a car. The first thing you're asked to do when starting is to pick your character, from this motley crew of dancing animals. Okay, maybe dancing is overselling it slightly. Outside of Diddy himself and a Kremlin called Crunch, none of the Kong characters actually feature in this game. Instead, we have a few of Rare's other characters, including Conker, before he had his infamous bad fur day, and Banjo in his first appearance in a video game.
I'm Banjo!
The rest are characters made specifically for this game, none of whom we'd hear much from again. After that, he dropped into a central hub from which you can access various different worlds and compete in races within them. Winning a race will give you a gold balloon. Collect enough of those and you'll unlock additional races to compete in. On top of this, you can find gold balloons hidden within the hub world, and there are keys and other secrets within the racetracks which themselves unlock additional challenges. Challenges which, when completed, give you even more collectibles. And, you guessed it, there are bosses. This style of gameplay makes Diddy Kong Racing the first example of an adventure racer. The racing is, of course, the primary function of the game, but a lot more emphasis has been placed on creating a compelling single player experience too. But what's the racing actually like once you get down to it? Well, it's a lot of fun. Crucially, the Mario Kart formula hadn't yet been set in stone, so kart racers of this period didn't just have to copy what Mario Kart was doing. And Diddy Kong Racing feels so different that it takes a fair bit of getting used to. Take the power-ups for example. Each power-up is represented by a coloured balloon, and the colour dictates what you'll get from it. Blue balloons are speed boosts, red are projectiles, green are traps, and yellow are shields. There are also multicoloured balloons, which can help improve your magnetism. Collecting multiple of the same balloon will power up your power-up, a fact which the game is very keen on reminding you of at any opportunity. This adds a little tactics to your racing. Do you use that speed boost now? Or wait and see if you can get another one and have an even bigger boost? Should you hold on to your homing rocket in case someone pulls ahead of you? It's a fascinating system, and another thing that will be borrowed in at least one other racer. The drifting's also a little different, partly because there's no hop as you go into a drift, and partly because you don't get a mini boost from it. It's also really easy to spin out if you're not careful. In addition to cars, you can also pilot a plane and a hovercraft. Most levels will give you a specific vehicle to race with, but some let you pick before going in. Each one plays similarly to the kart, but is different enough to make you modify your racing to match. I personally found the hovercraft to be the weakest of the bunch. Maybe it's just me, but it felt remarkably clumsy to control, and I kept getting stuck on corners. Nevertheless, the vehicles provide a nice variety in gameplay, and do a good job at keeping the experience fresh. I didn't get super far in the game because I'm appallingly bad at it, but it felt strangely nostalgic to play despite the fact that I've never played it before now. Maybe it was the locations, maybe it's because it's an adventure racer in a world bereft of adventure racers, or maybe it's because so many of its elements have been used and reused in other games I have played that there was a sort of familiarity about it. Contemporary reviews for the game, despite being a little mixed, all had one thing in common. The game was considered better than Mario Kart 64. Rare themselves saw it as a success, and actually planned 2 follow-ups. The ill-fated Donkey Kong Racing for GameCube, and Diddy Kong Pilot for Game Boy Advance, which was later reworked as Banjo Pilot following Rare's acquisition by Microsoft. This didn't mean the end of Diddy Kong Racing though. Almost 10 years later, the game was remade for the Nintendo DS, and would be, to date, the last game developed by Rare to feature Nintendo characters. It's virtually the same game with slightly improved graphics, but there were a few changes made. The touchscreen is used mainly to show your status and position on the track. At the start of the race you can also use it to give yourself a starting boost, although it only really works if you use the stylus left-handed, otherwise it's virtually the same game. You may also notice a few character changes. Banjo and Conker have been replaced with Dixie and Tiny Kong. The former because Banjo was, and remains, property of Microsoft, and the latter because this was after he had his infamous bad fur day. The only other thing to mention is that there's a plot this time. Yeah, there was a plot in the N64 game, but it wasn't exactly front and centre. This time there's a cutscene showing the game's final boss, Whizpig, harassing some of the other characters. And apparently the solution to this problem is to race? Sure, okay. In the previous Hits 40 videos, I've covered games and series with which I've been somewhat familiar. Each of them contains at least one game from my childhood, and so I've always had a bit of background going in. With Donkey Kong, I had no idea what to expect. Most of these games I've only just played them for the first time, and now, I wonder how I missed out all these years. It feels like each game brings something completely fresh and exciting to the table, with the exception perhaps of Donkey Kong 3. And they all have a story to tell. Even the low points in the series still make for fascinating gaming experiences. Okay, the Kong may have taken a backseat to his breakout co-star, but that's just given him the opportunity to feature in games that go against the grain a little. Mario games have certain expectations to meet, whereas Donkey Kong games can just go ape. And so while the series isn't one of Nintendo's top franchises, it may be one of the most interesting to look back on. It does things differently, and it's drawn quite a crowd. So much so that since the N64 era, Donkey Kong has been a staple character in Mario's lineup of party games. Ever wanted to see a gorilla ride a bike? Or a horse? Or shoot hoops? DK even shows up in baby form in Yoshi's Island DS, further adding to the mystery of his age. Unless that's actually Cranky. At this point, who knows? Even his Kong comrades get invited on occasion. Tiny Kong was most recently seen in Mario Super Sluggers, and King K. Rool is playable in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. And if you're at all familiar with the Mario Kart Wii competitive scene, you're probably aware just how well loved Funky Kong is. Point is, even though many of these characters haven't had a full proper mainline game in decades, they're still loved enough to keep making appearances here and there. Apart from Junior, he hasn't shown up since Mario Tennis. Poor guy. There are still other games we haven't had a chance to look at. There's the line of Donkey Kong Game & Watch games, for example, many of which have been resurrected on the Game Boy Advance. There was DK King of Swing, a puzzle game involving, well, swinging, as the name suggests. It takes a lot of cues from the Rare games, and even got a DS sequel called Jungle Climber. And, of course, the countless knockoffs. You can't have a successful arcade game without there being scores of games for other systems, contemporary and otherwise, blatantly capitalising on that success. And that's the end. In short, Donkey Kong's legacy is resonant, and the games themselves are more fun than a barrel full of monkeys. Okay, one more game. I threw a name out earlier when discussing DK's GameCube lineup, Donkey Kong Country 4. While Jungle Beat clearly took a lot from the Country games, the final product ended up being its own standalone thing. Nevertheless, fans still wanted more. So, in 2010, Donkey Kong Country triumphantly returned in Donkey Kong Country Returns. Naturally, Rare weren't involved with this game at all. Instead, it was developed by Retro Studios, the team behind Metroid Prime of all things. You can probably guess the plot here. But what's this? Where are the Kremlings? In this game, they've been replaced by this group of floating tiki masks. Where have I seen that concept before? Anyway, they hypnotise all the animals, Banana Horde gets pinched, Diddy gets kidnapped. Seems to happen to him an awful lot, huh? Donkey Kong naturally doesn't take too kindly to this. And literally the first thing you do in this game is introduce his Switch-flavoured assailant to Lefty and Righty. Something I wish more games would let me do. When you get into it, the game plays quite a lot like the original Country games, but with a decent chunk of Jungle Beat's DNA woven in for good measure. Unfortunately, we're back in Waggle territory. After all, this is a Wii game, meaning it's got to have motion controls whether you like it or not. You have essentially the same moveset as before. DK can roll around to attack, and he can drum his hands on the ground, to much greater effect this time. Drumming can alter the environment in a variety of ways, but is mostly there to expose secret items and areas. It takes a little getting used to, because the Kong feels a little floatier than he did previously. He also can't continuously roll through enemies, not yet anyway. Eventually you reach Diddy, who has once again been stuffed into a barrel, as is tradition at this point. Instead of being a playable tag-along character, however, this time he just sits on your back and tanks your hits for you. He's also brought his jetpack with him from DK64, meaning you get a little extra boost to your jumps. And if you're a fan of rolling, Diddy's the monkey to see. In this game, instead of each Kong effectively acting as a hit point, you actually have a health bar. 2 of the hits belong to Diddy, so lose them and you lose your monkey friend. It wouldn't be a Donkey Kong game without extra collectibles, and DKC Returns has plenty to find. The KONG letters and banana coins return from previous entries, but you can also find hidden orange jigsaw pieces. They seem remarkably familiar. Anyway, collect all the jiggies in a level and you'll unlock some bonus artwork. Banana coins can be used in between levels to buy bonus items from Cranky. He sells extra lives as well as the secret sniffing parrot Squawks. And hey look, I told you banana juice was a thing. Give him enough coins and you can buy a key, which opens up access to extra levels. And the bosses are, well, the bosses. As you can see, there's plenty to do in this game, and it's certainly a great entry in the series. I personally found the antagonists to be a little on the drab side. The main rank and file are fine, and each enemy has their own attack patterns, meaning you're not just rolling into everything. But there's not a lot of variety, and I do feel like it's lost something by dropping the Kremlings. Nevertheless, the game is a bunch of fun, and 4 years later it got a sequel in the form of Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. And by golly is this an overproduced cutscene. I don't think I needed such an extreme close-up, but I got it, and misery shared is misery halved, or something. Anyway, it appears to be Donkey Kong's birthday, but it gets interrupted by penguin pirates? No, I have no idea either. Somehow they're even less an exciting an antagonist as before. They freeze the entire island and fling everyone involved to a different island. There's not a whole lot to add about this game, it's more of the same, and that's far from a complaint. In fact, it's improved massively by the presence of one simple change. You can use a controller. What a concept. Actually, there is another major difference. You're not just limited to Diddy as a partner this time. Dixie and Cranky have come along for the ride too, and each one has an ability unique to them. Dixie's helicopter hair gives a little more lift to your jumps, while Cranky pulls a Commander Keen, using his cane as a pogo stick. Not only that, but if you slap a high five with your Kong buddy, you'll clear all the enemies on the screen and convert them into items. Seems like pretty dangerous knowledge to me. Otherwise, it's just more Donkey Kong Country. And while Rare had nothing to do with this one either, the game's score was actually composed by David Wise, who had previously worked on the original SNES games. So, at least in one sense, it's got a little of that Rare magic to it. Since the release of Tropical Freeze, there haven't been any new Donkey Kong games. Barring ports, that is. The giant gorilla continues to be a fan favourite, however, and the games have left one hell of a legacy. You only need to look at the reaction to King K. Rool's arrival to Smash Bros. To work that one out. Couple that with the popularity of games such as Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair, a game unashamedly inspired by Donkey Kong Country. Indeed, a game made by many of the same people. DK's cultural influence can't be ignored either. Take this example from 2019. After the gender dysphoria charity Mermaids was withheld funding from the National Lottery, a streamer called H-Bomber took it upon himself to raise the money instead, by playing none other than Donkey Kong 64 over a 57-hour period. Not only did this help the charity and bring a lot of press their way, it also made Donkey Kong into an icon for trans rights overnight. The latest development for the series comes from a 2021 press release, with the addition of a Donkey Kong themed area to the Super Nintendo World theme park, due to be completed in 2024. So the Big N hasn't forgotten about him either. For Nintendo's oldest video game franchise, DK hasn't done too badly for itself. While it may not be the gold standard of platformers that it once was, it's still got its merits, and the older games hold up surprisingly well. It's a series that's earned a lot of respect, and maybe someday Donkey Kong 64 will get the sequel it deserves. Over on the live channel, it's the Broken Circus broadcast, coming to you on Mondays and Fridays at 7 PM. And next up here, it's adventure, excitement, and sort of platforming in Load Runner Hits 40.